Did you ever find yourself wondering what is the basis of law in Western society? Well, much of it actually comes from the Bible, and we're entering the Book of the Covenant in our Exodus series, so join us today. Hey guys, and welcome back to God's Word Made Simple by Simple Servant Ministries. My name is Aaron Hawk, and if this is your first time visiting with us, I just want to say welcome and thank you for joining us today. God's Word Made Simple is an online discipleship ministry dedicated to taking God's Word and making it simple. We want to help you understand God's Word, apply it to your life, and grow in your relationship with the Lord. And by the way, if you appreciate this ministry and content, at some point make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn that bell notification to all so you don't miss any future videos. We would love to have you as part of our family. Okay guys, this is about the most awkward teaching video that I have made yet, so buckle up because this one gets a little interesting. A couple of things that I want to say. One, we're entering into what is known as the Book of the Law. Now a lot of people would, or the Book of the Covenant, but a lot of people would say, well, isn't that the whole Bible or the Old Testament or something like that? But when you're talking about it from a traditionally Jewish perspective or a textual standpoint within Exodus, we had the Ten Commandments that we gave. By the way, if you didn't catch that, catch at least the Ten Commandments, if not the last two videos, because those are going to be important. There are some things that I'm going to reference in this video that go back to those videos. But the Ten Commandments are a summary. And now we're entering, starting in chapter 21, we're entering a section where we're going to take those principles and actually flesh them out in real life. Okay, well, what about this situation? How do I apply those principles or those commands given in the Ten Commandments? So that's kind of what's going on in chapter 21 and following. So that's really important to understand. Another thing that's really going to throw you for a loop in this passage, or maybe you're watching this later and you found this video on Google and you're like, I want to see what this guy has to say about that. Yeah, this is one of those passages, but it doesn't have to be, okay? So a couple of foundational things. First off, I would highly recommend that, and I referenced in one of the last videos, I haven't finished reading it, but there's a book called Seeing Through Western Eyes or Reading Through Western Eyes. I'll try and remember to put a link in the description, but it would be a really good read to read that book, because we do, especially in the Old Testament, we tend to interpret everything just as people through our own culture and perspective. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the Old Testament deems a slave. And as soon as I say that word, the YouTube algorithms and all that are going to pop off, and, people are going to get bent out of shape, especially the last couple of years, because the powers that be would like us all to be at war with each other instead of learning how to get along. But here's the thing. Slavery in the Old Testament is not the same as what we think of as slavery. So I'm not going to get into modern day slavery from a couple of hundred years ago. Modern slavery actually is still going on. There are slaves all throughout the world to this day. So if you didn't know that, well, now you do. Cue the more you know thing if you're from my generation, right? Slavery still happens today in the very negative sense of slavery. But in the Old Testament, and especially when we're talking about the nation of Israel, slavery in this context does not mean what we think it means when we read through Western eyes, when we read the Bible through our filter. As soon as we see the word slavery, we're like, oh, that's horrendous, that's horrible. And look, I agree, slavery in the way that we think about it, not okay, not at all okay. But what they actually mean is more the idea of an indentured servant, somebody who either willingly or because of debt or necessity sold their work for a determined amount of time for a determined amount of price. Okay, think about that for a second. They sold a certain amount of work for a certain amount of time for a certain price. Doesn't that sound a lot like a salary? And I know there's probably somebody out there going, how dare you make that comparison? Well, from an academic standpoint, that's the only way to see it when we're talking about the nation of Israel during this time period in this context in Exodus chapter 21. So I'm not making a blanket statement. I'm sad that I even have to make all these qualifiers in the last few years. If you're watching this years from now, then that may not make sense, but 2020, 2023 have been pretty insane, and everybody is really on edge, especially when it comes to these issues. And I think we need to take a deep breath and look at the facts and see what's going on. In this context, the word slave is more analogous to an indentured servant or just a hired worker. So a couple of things that are really important. It was standard practice, and we'll see this in the text, but again, I have to give the qualifiers ahead of time for this video. It was standard practice for an Israelite to sell themselves, I have to do the air quotes, sorry, to sell themselves to another Israelite for 6 years. Because here's the thing. Who is the nation of Israel at this point in history? A bunch of slaves that had been delivered from Egypt. And by the way, Israel's slavery to Egypt originally was more of an indentured servant type of thing. Later turned into something very much not okay. Part of the reason that God delivered them, one of many reasons, but they had been slaves, true slaves. And God delivered them and is now helping them set up a government known as Israel with the Hebrew or Israelite people. So you have a group of people who had been slaves and are now setting up a government with rules and laws, and this is how you should do this in a way that honors God. So slavery, in the way that we understand that in the Western world, in the modern understanding of slavery, not okay, was never okay. But it's a little bit confusing when you read this, you read that word slavery and you don't understand the background behind it and the words behind it, the Hebrew behind it, as well as the culture and what was actually going on. And, you know, years ago, that's how some people supported the concept of slavery in the modern world. It's a wrong interpretation of the passage. So, slavery during this time, sorry, I'm derailing myself, but I'm trying to be careful and thorough and quick. Not three things that are easy to do. But slavery, you had Israel who had just been true slaves, now freed. Do you really think that they would support enslaving other people at this point? Much less that God would tell them to? No. And again, I hope this is all making sense. Maybe the best way that I can explain this, again, just because God is regulating sin or describing what people do, doesn't mean that he's saying it's okay. So just because he's saying this is what happens, he's not saying this is the goal or the ideal. But let me share with you from Exodus 22 later on, and we'll get to that soon, but it talks about if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So basically what's going on here is there's somebody stealing and you have to pay back 7 or, however many fold. I think elsewhere it was 7-fold, not in that passage. In this case, it was 5 and then 4, right? There's another passage where it's 7-fold. But anyway, the point here is just as it's obvious in Exodus 22 that God is not saying it's okay to steal, right? The fact that God is laying out the law, when this happens, this is how you should regulate it. That doesn't mean that it's okay to steal. He's simply saying, here is the set of laws and how you deal with it. And that's what's going on in this first section here in Exodus 21. It's just hard because those are hot button issues in our modern context. But in this case, God is setting up the laws for how to manage what it's calling slavery. Again, that word slavery here is not the same. I feel like I'm repeating myself ad nauseum. But it is not the same as what we understand in the modern era through Western eyes. It would actually be more like what we would call a contract job. I should have just started with this. My wife is a nurse, and during the pandemic, she took one contract job for 13 weeks, And so she was paid a lump sum of money. Well, actually, no, I think it was broken up. Anyway, it was much more than what she would normally get paid to work during the pandemic. And some contracts during that time were obscene. I remember seeing some in New York. I think it was like, $100,000 for 2 months worth of work or something really crazy like that. My wife didn't take one of those, but she did take one. And basically it was, hey, I'm going to work for X number of weeks, this many hours, this many days a week, and you're going to pay me this amount of money. When that contract is done, we part ways, or we say, hey, I liked it. Do you want to do it again? That's contract work. That's what's going on here in this scenario that we're going to be reading. So anyway, bottom line, slavery in this era is not the way that we interpret it through modern Western eyes. Now, I have reviewed this section in light of it being a more complicated section. I have not studied it in depth because life is just too crazy. Check out my most recent channel update if you want to know about that. But I will recommend two things. This one is Exodus. It's a Tyndale series commentary. So if you're not familiar with commentaries, it's essentially scholars that write, here's what we understand the Bible to mean in various sections. Here is another one that I would recommend. And so I'll try and remember to put the link in the description for these. But I would recommend if you really want to study this, and these guys do the background research and prove it through lots of various sources, what we're talking about, then I would recommend picking those books up or pick up Logos. Logos is a great software program that has a lot of these built into it. So anyway, that said, let's get into the text. So Exodus chapter 21, verses 1 through 11 is what we're covering today. Now these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. So now we're entering into the official codified law. Not that the Ten Commandments are not law, but this is, in other words, when you have a situation come up and you want to know how to flesh out the Ten Commandments, this is where you come. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years. So God is limiting the term. You can't sell yourself for 12 years, not even 7 years. Now, isn't it interesting that it's 6, and then the person is no longer allowed to be enslaved, right? See, there's a pattern related to the Sabbath that we talked about in previous videos. You'll notice this pattern kind of throughout the law. It's almost as if God thought it was really important. But notice God is setting the term limits, the contract limits here. If you buy a Hebrew slave, and by the way, elsewhere, just to further prove what I'm saying, I don't remember where offhand, but elsewhere, owning another fellow Hebrew was expressly forbidden in the law. Again, further proof, check out the commentaries, my description, whatever. Anyway, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th year he shall go out as a free man without payment. Now, don't let that without payment throw you. It doesn't mean that he works for 6 years and doesn't get paid. It means that you two are no longer under a contract together, a contractual obligation. In other words, you're not paying him more during that 7th year. He is now free to go find other employment. Maybe even kind of like a union. You know, you sign a contract, you work for a certain point, and then you're free to do whatever you want. Although in the unions, you better not come back to the union unless you're part of the union. But anyway. If he comes alone, meaning single, not married, no kids, if he comes alone, he shall go out alone. Now, another thing that's really important to bear in mind during this is that during the contract period, during the period of slavery, the contract period, the slave or servant would be obligated to do what the owner said. And that's why the language is a little stronger that way. They'd be required to do, within moral reasons, of course, or moral grounds. But in other words, you wouldn't just be free. If you indenture yourself, if you commit yourself under contract, you have to uphold the contract. So the contract would say something to the effect of, or was commonly understood, it wouldn't say it, it was commonly known that you would live on the premises with the master. So you would live there. You weren't allowed to just go randomly. You owed your service to them. You'd have to ask permission if you want to leave, if you want to get married, all these other things. You would have to ask permission because you were hired for this 6 years to do this certain job for a certain amount of money. So when it says here, if he comes alone, he shall go out alone. So in other words, you wouldn't have time to date during that 6 years unless it was within the land, property, service of the master to whom you indentured yourself. And Hebrews would not be forced to indenture themselves, by the way. And again, check out the commentaries. It's too much background research for me to present here. So take my word for it or go do the research on your own. Either way, but please don't Google it. Use academic resources like these commentaries. But a Hebrew would not be allowed to just flat out own another Hebrew. It's an indentured service. So anyway, if he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. So pretty cut and dry, right? Somebody commits to live within your sphere for 6 years. If they came in single, then they leave the way that they came. If they came in married, hey buddy, you don't get the wife and kids for free, right? They came in with them. That would have been part of the contract, but they're not yours to keep because they were his to begin with. So you come in married with kids, you leave married with kids. So those are kind of the two super simples. However you came in is how you leave. The complication comes when there is a marriage or family that grows during that time. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to the master. In other words, that would be a separate contract. Just because you got married doesn't nullify the second contract. So it's not saying, when it says gives him a wife, it's not saying, okay, now I've got my hooks in you forever. You're forever my slave. That's not the point here. The point is that the wife and thereby the children would be contractually obligated for whatever their period was. So let's just make up a scenario here. Let's say that a man indentured himself for 6 years. On year 3, another woman comes in as an indentured servant. She now has 6 years. The man only has 3 years left. They get married. They have children. Then when the 3rd year of the woman's contract is up, but the 6th year of the man's contract is up, well, you're not allowed to be on the master's property alone, or without a contract, right? This is a contract gig. You can't just live here for free, right? Room and board and all that are provided as part of the contract, but you can't just hang out here while your wife and children, or technically the wife, serves out her time, her remaining 3 years. So what do? That's the part that we're dealing with right now. So in essence, there will be a couple of options available. If I remember right, there's 3 options available. But the bottom line, if a master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall go out alone. In other words, you can't nullify the woman's contract just because you guys got married. And honestly, think about that. If you were, let's put it in the modern context. Let's say that you had either a union or a contract job of some sort. Just because people got married doesn't mean that the other contract goes away, right? You hire 2 different people under contract. Just because their life situation changes doesn't mean the contract is null and void. They and you signed a contract. Both parties have things that they have to uphold so that neither one gets ripped off. Right? It makes perfect sense. It's that when we read it through Western eyes here, that word slave, we just can't get past that in our Western mind. And again, point to the qualifiers that I made before about the differences and all of that. So in other words, if he wants to leave, he's free to leave, but he doesn't get to just take his wife and children with him because they are still under whatever that remaining contract is. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out a free man. Okay, here's another option. So going out alone, another option is he can just be a perpetual contract employee. and it uses the term slave here. So verse 6, then his master shall bring him to God. In other words, probably before the temple, to the temple, seek God's guidance as well as the formal covenant being between them and God. Then he shall bring him to the door of the doorpost. And it's a little unsure whether that means the doorpost at the temple or whether the doorpost of the home. I tend to think it's the doorpost of the home, but it's vague here. And this is a tricky section, by the way. Books have been written on this. So this is a tricky question or section. But regardless, he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. And so let's back up there. Okay, so that's the second option. Now, the third option that is implied, it's not stated, men and women could indenture themselves. That's the part that's not explicitly stated here. Again, we know that it is implied, but we know that also through study of the era during the time that this clearly is talking about. In other words, other sources that give us more information. So the third option is they both finish their contract. So the one guy serves his 6-year contract. Now he either has to leave and not be around his wife and children for 3 years, or make a further commitment. So the further commitment, according to the law here, is forever. And you might say that's really drastic, and we can always judge other times and cultures, although in this case, this is God through the law telling Israel this is what you're supposed to do. But it's really easy to judge that. But here's the thing. The people that indentured themselves, it wasn't a hard life in terms of they didn't have to figure out where they were going to live, where food was going to come from. They'd report to work. They would do their job. They would come home. They would get paid. They had a home. They had somewhere to live. They had food, all the stuff that you need to survive, right? So the thing is, if they leave, they don't have any of that. They no longer have a home. They no longer have guaranteed food. So it was not uncommon that you would have someone in Israel that owned a lot of slaves or indentured servants, and they wanted to be there because they got money and they didn't have to worry about what they were going to do, right? Hard times come, that's on the boss, not the employee, at least until somebody gets fired. But in this case, these are covenant contracts, if you will. There is a difference. So it wasn't necessarily unusual. And in fact, if you were single when you came in, you had no hope. Who would sell themselves for 6 years? Who would just say, okay, I'm going to give you 6 years of my life, except people that desperately need somewhere to be and a guaranteed income? So if you have a single guy coming in, he didn't have a home. It would be exceedingly unlikely. I can't fathom any circumstance in which this guy would already have a home and an established life somewhere because he chose to indenture himself. So you get married, now you have kids and a wife to take care of. Where are you going to go? You got to wait my example being the 3-year overlap. And now what do you do with them? Right? I mean, if you can't find other work, you're going to end up indentured somewhere else. So it actually kind of makes sense that your family security is found in the benefactorship, if you will, of this relationship. And again, this messes with our minds because of our understanding that we're trying to superimpose back on the text. Check out my series, if I didn't already point to 4 Secrets to Life and the Bible. Okay. So basically, if he doesn't want to just be free after that, then he can become a permanently indentured servant. In the technical sense, a slave, but again, not in the way that we interpret that. Now, verse 7 is interesting. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, now that one we're going to have a problem with. Again, Western eyes, but there's also, well, it is Western eyes. In this culture, in this time, God is regulating practices that happen. So there's one qualifier. But this entire culture, this was before God's giving of the law. This entire culture, the women were functionally property. I don't think that it was perceived that way. I don't think they thought of them in exactly those terms the way that we would. Again, Western eyes looking back. But the bride the marriage would be arranged beforehand. It was arranged marriages. So you would have a father make a deal with someone else, and money would be exchanged, and then the daughter would be given as the wife to whatever husband was desired. Well, it was not unusual for the rich people during that time, or even others, but especially the rich ones that could afford more things, like, hey, a bride. It was not unusual that they would purchase or have this sort of quasi marriage set up ahead of time, where they would purchase a young woman, a girl often, and raise her in the home. So arbitrarily, you've got a family that is really down on their luck. It's starve or nothing. They sell their daughter because eventually she's going to be sold anyway in this culture. Again, I know that grates against you from a Western perspective, but we see stuff like that in the world to this day. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. We're regulating things in this section. But your family's going to starve. You've got a 6-year-old daughter you can't afford to feed. I can't fathom selling my daughter. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, I got words for that. But again, different culture, different circumstances, Western eyes. You have a 6-year-old, you can't feed your family. There's this rich person willing to take your daughter in and pay you money and promises to give her a good life. Do you take it? I can't say there's no circumstance in which I could understand that. Well, that person now owns the daughter. It was very common, or at least not uncommon, that someone that was wealthy would purchase a wife ahead of time for their son. Or one of their slaves. Maybe one of their indentured servants is clearly in need of a wife, and he's like, well, might get more work out of him if I give him a wife. Hey, let me introduce you. Because again, arranged marriages were the thing. So anyway, again, the bottom line is it was not unusual for someone that was wealthy to go ahead and purchase someone young, like a 6-year-old or something like that. It's really more analogous to an adoption within the framework of an arranged marriage culture. So they are going to be cared for, the daughter would be cared for, and she would also be raised in their home, which would kind of guarantee that her family culture matched her future husband's culture because she's going to be raised in that home. So again, that's a lot of explanation. I told you this was a tricky passage. This video is way long already. So verse 7, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. Now, it's not because there is some qualitative difference. It's because in their culture, women did not do things alone. They were property, so to speak, the way that we would interpret it anyway. She had to be given to someone in marriage. So you had this transfer from one family to the other. It would be inappropriate in their culture to let her just go free. That would be something along the lines of harlotry in their culture. So it's in her best interest in this culture, in this circumstance. It's actually in her best interest not to be freed in that sense, but also because in this arranged marriage situation, you have a contract that was made between her family and the owner who bought her for his son or a servant or someone. So you have a contract that has to be honored here. So interesting here is to note that the Bible is not prescribing arranged marriages. It is here regulating the culture of the time. This is not God saying, this is how I want marriages to work. At the same time, the Bible doesn't forbid arranged marriages. There's something to think about. That ought to get the comment section fired up. If you haven't left comments by now, feel free to leave me comments and let me know. I mean, I'm actually being serious. I'm curious how I'm communicating and what you're receiving from this, and of course, what your thoughts and reactions are. Again, I know this is a major, I'm trying to use the nice word, it messes with your mind reading through Western perspective here. But God is regulating this practice that already exists. He's not setting this up as the model. In fact, the model, well, ironically, the model was Adam and Eve, which was an arranged marriage by God. But since we don't usually have God directly handing us to our spouse, but anyway, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. What does that mean to be redeemed? Remember, there is a contract. This family sold their daughter to this family. If this family, if it doesn't work out for her to be the bride, let's say the guy's son dies, or the guy's son just doesn't like her, or they just don't like her, then it's okay for her to go back to her father's house, but her father would then have to pay the price that he was originally given. In other words, reimburse the owner. And again, I know the idea of property is very demeaning and messes with our minds, but we're talking about a different culture in a different time. Not justifying it, we're just helping you to understand it. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority. So this is protecting her in an era where women weren't really protected. In other cultures that practiced this type of marriage, the woman had zero rights. But God is here saying, look, if you're going to do this practice, here's how you do it in a way that honors me the best it's going to. Maybe that's the best way to paraphrase it. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. I mean, think about it. He grew up, arbitrarily with my example, she's 6 years old. She grows up in this household being told, this is your family, learn how to do life our way. And then all of a sudden, we changed our minds. We're going to sell you to some other country halfway across the world. One, it's unfair to set her hopes and desires on whatever that marriage was supposed to be, so she's lost out there, but it's definitely not okay to just offload her randomly. If he designates her for his son, this is where we're finally coming to what I was talking about. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. Again, I already explained that. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food. So in other words, God never said it was okay to have multiple wives. But again, God is here regulating human action. You guys are doing this by culture anyway. If you're going to do it, let's at least regulate it in a way that's going to be as honoring as possible. And again, I know this is hard to explain in a video like this. You're thinking, yeah, Aaron, that doesn't make any sense. Please do the studies. If you're struggling with that, you're just going to have to dig into a lot of different stuff to come to that understanding. And I wish I could help you with a shortcut to that other than just, hey, believe me, which I don't generally find to be acceptable. So anyway, the point here is that he can't just say, well, I like this other woman better, so yeah, I already married you, but I don't think I'm going to feed you or clothe you anymore. So he's regulating this. So if he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food. So in other words, he still has to provide for her food and her clothing and her conjugal rights. So in other words, you can't just make the poor woman a destitute person who never sees her husband just because you couldn't be satisfied with her. Truthfully, this is adultery in this circumstance, and that is explained and dealt with in the law elsewhere. Remember, this is kind of an opening salvo because, again, like I told you before, Israel is used to doing things the way that they did it in Egypt. And now they're being brought into, they're technically still receiving this somewhere around the mountain, but now they are having to figure out how to form their own government. So again, God is trying to reset their thinking. I talked about that in the previous videos. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. In other words, her family does not need to redeem her. It's not saying, hey, if that's the case, just kick her out of the house without a penny to her name. No. The payment of money is talking about the redemption. In other words, if he's going to treat her so unfairly, then the father's household doesn't have to make that payment. They get to keep the money they originally got, and they get their daughter back because she's not being treated fairly according to their contract. Wow. If any video I have ever done so far is going to stir up more controversy, this is the one. So, let me know your thoughts. You're probably going to want to read through this a few times and watch this one a few times, because this is a tough section to try and teach through social media kind of a format. And especially not knowing, if this is your first time visiting our channel, you have no idea who I am or how I interpret or whether I'm a trustworthy person. And even if you regularly watch, it's different than being in a relationship and knowing that to be able to interpret and trust what I'm saying. So anyway, I hope all of that makes sense. At the very least, let me know in the comments if what I said made sense. Did I teach it in a way that you can understand it? Or does it just sound like it's, the modern patriarchal, down with the patriarchy kind of a thing? That's not what it is, but I totally get it, that it comes across that way. And again, we're not saying this was the goal. This was not the ideal or the goal. This is God regulating in your government. Here are some basic rules. Remember also, we'll put the reference here, but remember also, people asked Jesus about divorce. Hey, Moses allowed people to get divorced, and Jesus' response, Aaron paraphrase, yeah, Moses did allow people to get divorced because you guys are too hard-hearted to follow God's ideal plan. In other words, you couldn't handle just following God's plan. Therefore, God had to regulate your sin. That's what's going on in this section. So anyway, that said, again, let me know in the comments what you think. If you appreciate this ministry, check out my video, how to support your favorite YouTube channel. At the very least, hit that like button, hit subscribe, turn that bell notification to all so you don't miss any future videos. We'd love to have you as part of our family. All right, guys, thank you very much, and God bless.